Okay, now that we've covered the blood, we are going to move on to the structure of the heart. So we're going to start by talking about the cardiovascular system. And the cardiovascular system that you see with humans is called what we consider to be a closed circulatory system. If you look at simpler animals, they don't actually have blood vessels. They have a heart that pumps, and then the blood drips over the tissues and feeds it, and then gets collected back up in the heart. But usually these are really small organisms. Insects have an open circulatory system. Not fish. Fish do have blood vessels, but insects do, like some of the simpler worms have open circulatory systems. When you start getting more advanced organisms that have a head and have a nervous system and are larger in size, you need blood vessels to actually carry the blood to all of the parts of the body. So basically we have a heart that pumps blood. The blood vessels then will allow the blood to circulate. The whole role of the cardiovascular system is to deliver oxygen and nutrients to the cells and to remove carbon dioxide and other waste products. So if you're looking at the position of the heart in the body, it is located in the chest. So it's the thoracic cavity. It is between your lungs. To be exact, if you look at the lobes of the lungs, the left lung only has 2 lobes and the right lung has 3 because the left lung, the heart is sitting in the chest cavity closer to the left lung. The heart has a point at the bottom of it that's called the apex, and that point in the heart points towards your left hip. And if you're going to look at the size of it, it is about the size of a fist. So here's a picture of where it sits in the thoracic cavity. If you look, that apex sits right on top of the muscle, which is your diaphragm. And the diaphragm is a muscle that contracts, that causes your basically your respiration, causes you to inhale and exhale. It has, as you can see, it is sitting a little bit closer to the left side than it is the right side. So you have the lungs on either side, you have the diaphragm on the bottom of it that it's sitting on, and then you've got the major blood vessels that are entering and going out of the heart, which we will learn. I'll skip through the slides that you're going to fill in. Like all of the organs, it has a double serous membrane. Remember, that means that there's a membrane that lies on the surface of the organ, and then there's fluid in between and a membrane that lies towards the body cavity. So the names of those, remember, visceral is the name of the serous membrane that lies on the organ. Parietal is the one that lies towards the body cavity. And since we're talking about the heart, the membrane that surrounds it is called the pericardium. So my visceral pericardium is next to the heart. My parietal pericardium is around the heart, but it is on the outside towards the body cavity. I'll get that back here. Okay, so if you're talking about the parietal pericardium, it is the one that's on the outside. So the serous fluid is the space between, basically when you're talking about the heart and you're talking about the lungs, because they move when the heart beats, and when you inhale and exhale, that fluid helps to allow those organs to move and to glide without actually hitting a surface that would cause damage. If we were to dissect the layer of the heart wall, there are 3 layers to it. And exactly when you look at the sheep hearts, the left side of the heart is a lot thicker than the right side of the heart because the left side of the heart pumps to the body. The right side of the heart only pumps to the lungs. So remember, epi is outside, myo tends to be middle, and endo is inside. So if you're looking at those 3 layers, the epicardium is on the outside. And so this is that actual parietal pericardium, and it has a layer of connective tissue over it. The myocardium is in the middle, and the middle layer of the muscle is actually going to be cardiac muscle, and then the inner layer is an endothelium. So here is the structure that you find in the heart, and we're going to go through all of these when we look at the sheep heart. But the 2 upper chambers are called the atriums. The ventricles are the 2 lower chambers. The 2 blood vessels that lead into the right atrium are the superior and inferior vena cava. There is a valve between the atrium and the ventricles. So for the right side, it's the tricuspid valve. For the left side, it's the mitral valve. There is also a valve that goes from the ventricles to the blood vessels through which the blood exits. And when we look at the heart, the blood exits from the right side to the pulmonary arteries, and that takes it to your lungs. And then it comes back through your pulmonary veins to the left side. Left side of the heart will pump it through to the rest of your body, and it will exit through the aorta. So you do not need to know all of the blood vessels of the heart. Do notice on the outside of the heart you have both arteries and veins, and those are the ones that actually feed the heart. So if somebody has a heart attack, it is those coronary arteries that are blocked. A heart can contain oxygenated blood, but if those coronary arteries that feed the muscles of the heart do not get oxygen, then that's what happens when someone has a heart attack. The actual muscles are contracting, but they're no longer rhythmically contracting, so it doesn't push the blood out. So right and left side are separate pumps. You have 4 chambers to the heart. The atria receive the blood. So you have a right and a left atrium. The right atrium receives the blood from the body, and that's the blood that's going to be passed on to the lungs. The left atrium receives the blood from the lungs, and it's going to be pumped to the body. The ventricles are the discharging chambers. The right ventricle is not as large as the left ventricle because the right ventricle only has to pump from the heart to the lungs, whereas the left ventricle has to pump the blood with enough force to go throughout the entire body. So that has you write down the functions. So when you look at our circulatory system, it's called a double loop system. And reason for that, and on this notice, the blue blood is supposed to be oxygen poor, and we said that's actually a red color, but not as bright of red as oxygenated blood. That the veins will lead back into the right side of the heart with the vena cavas. From the right side of the heart, it is pumped to the lungs, and that's the first loop. It then comes back through the pulmonary veins to the left side of the heart. And then the left side of the heart with the aorta will pump it to the rest of the body. And so it goes through arteries as it goes away from the heart into smaller arterioles and then into capillaries. And then once the gas is exchanged and the nutrients are exchanged, then it goes back towards the heart in veins. It starts in the smallest of veins called venules, into larger ones until you get to the inferior and superior vena cava. So the loop that goes to your lungs is called the pulmonary circuit. The loop that goes to the cells in your body is called the systemic circuit. So that's why it's considered to be a double loop. In between each of the chambers, there are valves, and so that keeps the blood flowing in only one direction. So there are 4 valves. There are 2 that are between the atrium and the ventricles. Because they are between the atriums and the ventricles, they're called the Atrioventricular Valves. So on the right side of your heart, between the right atrium and the right ventricle, is the Tricuspid Valve. And these valves are simply flaps that when the ventricle chamber fills, it causes those flaps to close. There happen to be 3 flaps on the right side. That's why it's called the tricuspid. On the left side, between the left atrium and the left ventricle, it is a bicuspid valve. They more commonly call it now the mitral valve, and it has 2 flaps, and that's why it was originally named the bicuspid valve. There are blood vessels that the blood will exit from the ventricle. From the right ventricle, it will exit through a valve into the pulmonary artery, and that particular valve is called Pulmonary Semilunar. So both of the valves between the ventricles and the blood vessels are called semilunar valves because they look like half moons. So the one that leads from the right ventricle to the pulmonary artery is called the Pulmonary Semilunar Valve. The one that goes from the left ventricle to the aorta is called the Aortic Semilunar Valve. As the chambers pump, the valves open and the blood goes through it. There are strings that attach to both the tricuspid and the mitral valve because they're flaps, and those are called chordae tendineae. They're also called the heartstrings, and they keep the valve attached to the walls of the heart. The heart valves actually close so that it does not go backwards. If you have ever heard of anybody who has a heart murmur, the heart murmur comes from the fact that when the ventricle contracts, some of the blood goes back into the atrium instead of going forward into either the pulmonary artery or the aorta. You can hear that. The lub-dub sound when your heart beats is actually the sound of the valves closing. So usually a heart murmur can be detected by the sound. There's kind of a swoosh sound as it goes backwards. If they do an echocardiogram, then they can check to see that the valves are working properly. So some younger kids are born with heart murmurs, and they go away as they get older. If the heart murmur is because of a problem with the valve, then they may need to correct it if it gets worse. So here's a diagram showing both atria fill first. And so those valves will open as the atria contract and the blood goes into the ventricles. Once it goes into the ventricles, the atrioventricular valves close. Once the ventricles begin to pump, those semilunar valves open. And once the blood completely leaves the ventricles, the semilunar valves close. So the lub-dub sound, the first lub sound is the atrioventricular valves closing. The dub sound is the semilunar valves closing. So some of the blood vessels that exit from the heart, if you are talking about the left side of the heart, the artery that carries the blood from the left side of the heart to the rest of the body is called the aorta. The blood vessels that exit from the right ventricle of the heart are called the pulmonary arteries. So it goes through the pulmonary semilunar valve into what we call the pulmonary trunk. And the pulmonary trunk separates into a left and right side to take the blood to your lungs. The blood that actually enters the right atrium from the body through the veins that are called the Vena Cavas. There's a superior vena cava, which takes all the blood from the top part of the body into the right atrium, and there is the inferior vena cava, which takes it from the lower part of the body to the right atrium. The pulmonary veins will bring it back to the heart, and they enter on the left atrium. So whether or not it's an artery or a vein is not because of whether or not the blood is oxygenated. If the blood vessels carry the blood away from the heart, they're characterized as an artery. If they carry it towards the heart, they're characterized as a vein. So your pulmonary artery, which is carrying your blood from the right side of the heart to the lungs, is an artery, but the blood is actually deoxygenated. And the pulmonary vein is the other exception, where the blood is coming back from the lungs. Although it's in a vein, it is oxygenated. So for the most part, arteries are oxygenated and veins are deoxygenated, except for those two cases in the actual heart. So you are going to do a matching on the arteries. The other thing to keep in mind is that the chambers of the heart do not nourish the myocardium or the muscle of the heart. So it has its own circulatory system. It has coronary arteries and it has cardiac veins. That blood then empties into the right atrium by way of what's called a coronary sinus. So if somebody is having a heart attack, it is those coronary arteries that are blocked. And once the heart muscle becomes damaged, it cannot regenerate. So that part of the heart remains damaged. If you know of anybody who is in congestive heart failure, that's because part of the heart has been damaged over time due to sometimes mini heart attacks or one major heart attack. Okay, so we are going to stop there with notes. The second part of the notes on heart is going to be how the actual heartbeat occurs and how that electrical impulse is passed through the heart so that the atrium and the ventricles beat and it's coordinated.